As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
If history repeated itself vaguely, we would look at maybe 70, 80 years before the party begins to feel the weight of its own contradictions in this new era. And so if that's the case, and again, that's a big if, then we're looking at least 60, 70 years of the United States and China competing very intensely on this.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to episode 14 of the Security Nexus webinar, The Great Game of Digital Dominance. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at DKI APCSS. Technology has become the defining battleground of the 21st century. Control of AI, semiconductors, and other critical technologies will shape global power and prosperity. China's rapid rise challenges the United States' long-held technological dominance, sparking a new era of great power competition with a distinctly digital twist. This tech rivalry has far-reaching consequences. It's rewiring the rules of trade, security, and global alliances. From U.S. restrictions on Huawei to China's Made in China 2025 plan, each move is a technological and geopolitical play. But who will gain the ultimate advantage? Dr. John Hemmings, who has advised UK government departments on investment security and given evidence to 2 parliamentary defense committees on the Indo-Pacific region, joins us today to shed light on this rivalry. We'll examine how history echoes in the present-day U.S.-China tech struggle, assess strengths and weaknesses, and explore the potential consequences if China succeeds in becoming the leading global tech superpower. Beyond superpower competition, we'll investigate how this rivalry reshapes security and innovation for everyone. How can we govern the breakneck pace of technological change, ensuring safety, privacy, and fairness in an increasingly digital world? John, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I am super glad to have you here. Been looking forward to today's show together.
Likewise.
Tell us your story and how you came to this field.
So I want to thank you very much for having me, James. It's a real pleasure to be on, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. I have to start off by saying, I'm not a technology, I'm not an engineer, I didn't have a STEM subject. I'm very much a political scientist. My training is a PhD in international relations, and prior to that, international law and international security studies at King's College. So I come to this because technology really, I think over the last 10 or 15 years has inserted itself as one of the priority areas of national security for states.
Yes.
And you could argue it's some sectors like aerospace, it was ever thus, in the defense industries. But for everyday dual use items like semiconductors and telephones, which we all have, these are now being thrust into the limelight of international relations between great states, and as the topic of this study, great powers.
Yes.
So briefly, I came into this topic really around 2015, 2016. I was doing my PhD at the London School of Economics, and I was living in the United Kingdom, and Prime Minister Theresa May was looking for foreign funding to help with regenerating Britain's nuclear power industry. And there was a French consortium which also invited in a Chinese company in order to help build out that capability and finance it particularly. And under the previous British government, the security checks had been sort of waived. Theresa May decided to say, well, as a sort of, indicator to her hardliners, that she would just do a security check with a Chinese company. One of the individuals related to that company had been sort of indicated in espionage by the US. And so anyway, long story short, she was completely defeated. A standing prime minister in her own country tried to have a security check on a critical national infrastructure element. And I think all of us realized, the British newspapers had come out in support of the Chinese company. Many of them had deals with Chinese media. There were members of her own cabinet, some who resigned, who were very pro-China at the time. And she sort of just was really hands down defeated. And right after that, Huawei sort of became a primary topic of discussion in the UK in terms of building out 5G, replacing from 4G. And everyone thought, is the UK government does it still have the tools to regulate those foreign states that might want to buy, merge, acquire, or develop in the critical national infrastructures, particularly those with high tech? So I became very interested in the topic at the time, and I got swept away into the discussion over 5G and Huawei, ended up publishing some papers on that, doing a lot of media work. And it was sort of my gateway drug, as it were, to this topic, which I think, as we mentioned in the pre-episode discussion, is very complex.
It is.
So yeah, that's my entry point. And not everyone's from the UK, but everyone does business with China. Everyone has at least considered or done business with Huawei, and everyone's considered Chinese investment into their critical national infrastructure. And certainly everyone who's dealt with any of those things in a national security sense has thought about, well, how do we encourage trade while also regulating the acquisition of our technology firms from nefarious states that might want to leapfrog technology?
Fascinating. Let's start with history, yeah? And let's talk about the historical tech impact. The United States uniquely combines its role as a global policy leader with its forefront position in technological innovation, shaping strategic interactions worldwide. So then here's the question. What can history teach us about the ongoing tech rivalry between the US and China?
I think what history teaches us is that great powers, and I'm going to quote a Chinese strategic document, the 2016 outline for national innovation growth. Great powers rise and fall according to their ability to dominate strategic technologies. Now, I haven't got the wording exactly right, but I certainly encourage our audience to seek out that document and see that the ethos, the idea that the Opium Wars occurred because Britain had greater technology than the Qing dynasty is still that concept, that sort of historic fear is still alive and well amongst Chinese policymakers, and it has been from Mao onwards. But really, as I'll sort of show during I think this episode, is Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012 has really marked a sort of hardening of that strategic sense by PRC elites, and there's any number of strategic documents, the releasing of subsidies and funding to companies, a number of different policies designed to bring technology into China, to give that technology to Chinese leaders, and then to send those Chinese companies out as exporters in order that China will have some dominance over the global market in those techs. And Made in China 2025, which was published in 2015 and highlights 10 of those technologies, is one of those documents that we can discuss today.
Yeah, no, in fact, I want to do that. Let's just dive then. Let's talk a little bit about China's innovation. I mean, it has significant advantages in key technologies, rockets, smart cities, biotech, EVs, we can go on. So we might ask ourselves, which innovations have had the greatest global impact, and where does the U.S. still lead?
So the most interesting, and I'm going to start by being contrarian in my answer, the most interesting innovation has been in the economic model.
Okay.
And this is putting on our back foot. Of course, the rise of the semiconductor industry, the rise of Silicon Valley in the United States benefited from some government support, particularly from the Defense Department, same with the internet, and often very much so still the case with the defense industrial base. But largely, many sectors that China considers to be of national priority, like electronic vehicles, alternative energies, IT, telecommunications, those areas did not receive the sort of strategic funding and support inside the United States. And that's been the innovation that China has created. It's maintained a sort of capitalistic system. Chinese tech sector is still by and large private, but it has inserted Communist Party cells since the 2000s onwards heavily into strategic industries to give sort of direction to those planners, and also pointing those companies not only to markets that China is interested in, but to sources of funding like the Export-Import Bank, the People's Bank of China, and tried to create an overall strategic approach towards, as I said, bringing in the technology companies from the West, developing that technology in a sort of safe environment. You know, it's a protected market. Not many Western companies can just go in. Using that as a nursery for Chinese state-owned enterprises to build up, and new Chinese private sector companies to build up, especially we've seen it with the EVs and semiconductors, and then for those companies to go out once they're strong with state support and state funding. And so that is a very innovative way, and really, I think you've seen in some of the protectionism under the Trump administration, and also more recently with the Biden administration, attempts by the US to sort of develop policy counters that involve more US subsidies, more US state influence in these sectors that were traditionally sort of left out in the wilderness of capitalism.
It's interesting. On where countries are leading, I want to pull just a little deeper and ask you a few things. Is China leading in EVs?
Certainly in production and in manufacturing, but I think you would argue that their very nuanced approach towards Tesla, inviting Tesla in, being very opening and welcoming rather than punishing Tesla for US policies, would indicate that they're still interested in the high-end algorithms that Tesla developed. Remember, EVs are not just electrical vehicles, they're computers with wheels.
This is true.
These
I own too.
And so you'll well know, being an owner of them, that and even Elon Musk himself views these vehicles as essentially they are built on code. And so he's been, I think, very giving, and he's been able to build, you know, a large manufacturing capability to access the Chinese market. But I know the balance for him is not to give away too much of the IP, because like every other Western giant that goes into the Chinese market, if you lose control over your highest IP to a joint venture partner from China, you, even if you try to sue that company for stealing IP, they will win in the legal system. And so you will eventually be, you know, crowded out of the Chinese market by young, leaner, meaner, and better supported Chinese competitors. So I think he's being very careful not to give that up. But certainly I'd say EVs is one area. And then of course Huawei, who we thought was dead with 5G, is now back very much in the semiconductor field, and is working with CIMIC to sort of grasp the advanced semiconductor field with 5 nanometer capabilities. Still, I might say, built on a bedrock of US and Dutch lithography. So what they're doing is amazing, and full credit to them accomplishing this, where others like the Singaporeans and the Japanese did not. But on the other hand, they have to, you know, they got heavy supplies of the lithographic machines that ASML sold them before the US-China competition really took off. And so they are still riding high on that. And whether or not they're able to carry out the sort of next generation that lithography is going, and here I'm looking at companies like NVIDIA, that's still to be told. But it's still a very impressive, impressive achievements.
Boy, I'm going to constrain myself for right now to
it's an interesting topic, isn't it?
No, my goodness.
Absolutely.
I hope our audience is as deeply enthralled with this as you and I are. Let's move just a bit. Let's talk about China's strategies. I mean, you did allude to the Made in China 2025, and I even alluded to it in the opening. But it aims through this this policy. It aims to secure technological supremacy. Clearly, it's wanting to go, and it is gone beyond assembling to leading in these areas, and you alluded to the 10 pillars that it has there and there. So maybe here's the question: how effectively are these strategies propelling China toward tech superpower status?
Yeah, I think so if we go back to, and I hope you don't mind, I'm going to take our audiences a little bit back. Not too long of a digression, but to take us all the way back to 2000, when Xi Jinping is deputy party secretary of Fujian province, and develops, at the time, he co-ops a Chinese academics strategy called Digital Fujian. And Digital Fujian was, if you remember, 2000s, we sort of on the cusp of the digital age, and how data was sort of changing everything. And what they were thinking about is two different things. One is economic growth, how to lock that in so that your digital economy is, sort of driving instead of the traditional industry side. And then the second part is data as a way of enabling better social interaction. And remember, this is the Communist Party of China. They're obsessed with societal harmony, and that everyone is, equity. There's not too much disparity between rich and poor, and that, let's face it, the party knows what everyone is thinking, doing, and working on. And the digital age in the 2000s sort of heralded this. And in fact, Digital Capitalism, a book by Dan Schimmelin, was very popular in translation in China at the time. And so you have from Fujian a sort of outgrowth of, Xi Jinping is thinking about all these different things. And around 2012-13, when he becomes, chairman of the overall party in China, becomes sort of China's leader, cyber superpower is developed as an initial concept, which essentially the main thing you need to know about it is that this is not a competition about technology per se, but a competition about who builds, maintains, and runs the digital ecosystem of the world. And that the United States, in the Chinese ruled view, is going to try to contain China from doing that, and that in order to offset that, China has to move first. So you can argue that the United States has responded very strongly and say that, of course, they always would have done. You could argue that the Chinese started it by being, sort of thinking the Americans were going to do it, and so they leapt into action first. Either way, we are where we are. I suspect we're in a security dilemma, technology security dilemma, whereas one state seeks security from something which causes insecurity in the other. And I think dominance of the digital technologies is very much a technology. So after global cyber superpower is that policy in 2013, Xi Jinping starts to put into place different levers that enable him. And you see 2014, 2015, Chinese export banks all over Europe set up, and they go for the telecoms market there with 5G, with Huawei leading the charge, but with ZTE also doing a lot of great work there. They are selling at something like 16% of the costs of European competitors. So the European competitors are just sort of almost shoved aside. Yeah. And in fact, in 2017, 18, they begin to really push hard on different UK companies, some of them who are owned outright by the Chinese, like 3, which is owned by CK Hutchinson, which is a Hong Kong company, but very much close to China. And they start to really push in Paris, Berlin, and London to gain contracts in the build out of 5G. And remember, at this stage, Huawei is one of the few companies, aside from Nokia and Ericsson, that actually can build end-to-end this 5G network. And in fact, they do it much cheaper than everyone else, and they also promise, great economic returns, the Internet of Everything, that everyone's, if they also help with manufacturing, you could make smart factories much more lean. We're still sort of creeping up on this, but the Chinese have already taken off on this area. And then finally, the sort of, and I'll end on this, the preeminent strategy that has now sort of taken China by hold is Digital China, which I've written on with our former colleague Dave Dorman. And digital China is a concept about how China will be, sort of rejuvenated by becoming a modern socialist great power. And in order to become a modernist great superpower, it has to have the sort of leadership in these technologies. And it has under it a infrastructure build out domestically, which builds out, alternative energies, electric highways, new digital infrastructures called new type infrastructure. And this plan is, it really is incredible what they conceive of. It's like Belt and Road Initiative, but for China, and much, much more intensive and much, much more, in terms of money committed. It's something like 6 to 7 trillion US that they want to do over 5 years. So Xi Jinping is very, very serious and there's more strategic documents on the way to Made in China 2025. But Digital China and cyber superpower and digital Silk Road are all very, very powerful moments in different aspects of this drive for modernization.
John, brilliant. You asked me to think back to early 2000, and I did there momentarily. Late 90s, early 2000. I was in Beijing, Hong Kong, Dalian, Dandong, Shenyang, Harbin. It was a different time. Many would be surprised, you would not. The level of development was even phenomenal. And what you've described is even more so in the direction we're going. Let's talk a little bit about the tech Cold War. We'll call it that anyway. The U.S. and China, they are in an escalating tech battle, I would say. The U.S. has banned Chinese tech from its 5G networks and restricted semiconductor exports, and then aiming in an intentional purpose, I think, to slow China's technological progress in certain areas. China then retaliated, banning U.S. tech in its government computers, further raising the tensions. So, what are the broader implications of these escalating tensions for global tech leadership?
The interesting thing is, I think, standards. And we saw this particularly, and I hate to keep referring to 5G, but it was, for me, it was a sort of critical topic for me to get involved in this discussion. And if you look at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which has sort of been absorbed into the United Nations as an overall coordinating body for the future telecommunication standards, you see the Cold War at its most interesting, where different companies are in working groups within the ITU, are trying to push towards different standards. And you saw within the ITU over the last 7 years, pushes by Huawei and other companies to develop the next internet, the new internet that would sort of conform to Chinese standards. And so that standard setting is really important, and it's important for two different reasons. One is that if you set the standards, your companies are already halfway there to building out that sort of, maybe not monopolization, but certainly dominance in that sector if you are the ones that set the standards. And then second, you also develop a certain level of access and control over the data in the alternative approach. Current internet is, it's leaky. It wasn't designed for security. It's terrible. But at least information packets are, even if you intercept them, you have to then try to find out what the code says or what the information says, what the data says. Under some of these new imaginings, states would have far more control over those data packets, or access, everyday access to knowing what people are saying. And so hiding behind your IP address or behind a VPN would be almost impossible in these new systems. So there is a little bit, people say, well, there's no such thing as authoritarian technology. And that's true, but technology that allows for certain privacy of, can support debates without threatening people. So there's the internet as it is supports a certain level of political discourse and debate behind that anonymous wall, and that might be stripped out. The other ways that it relates to are in the future technologies that are going to sort of dominate the future of the global economy, and semiconductors is the obvious one to that. I know we were both waiting to get there. I've cracked the bell. Let's go into semiconductors. Foundational technology, much like AI. We'll get into AI as well, but semiconductors, essentially, everything you're going to run on them, from a phone to a tank to an aircraft carrier, is going to have hundreds of thousands of these things, and the ability for example, in the military sense, in a near-peer war, to have sensors that can see, identify, and categorize an enemy unit, whether it's an aircraft or a satellite or an individual, more quickly. It gives the operator quicker time to respond and fire quicker. And also, you want these things to be made domestically, because if someone else makes them, they can switch off your plane or switch off your... chips, if they're interfered with, are very difficult to tell that they've been interfered with. You can sit with one for a few days and do all sorts of different tests on it. It's very hard to know if something has physically been altered on a chip, to make sure that if you give it the right sensor, it does something that it's not expected. Right. So as we discussed already, China is intense heavily on getting its own sense of insecurity on semiconductors, means that it's driving very hard in this space. We saw with the U.S. CHIPS Act in 2022, the United States is not itself, it absolutely is going to follow the Chinese direction and start supplying its own industry with subsidies, billions and billions, up to 40 billion, and also trying to build out the education required in the workforce. I saw from a White House USA fact sheet when I was preparing for this talk that something like 50 community colleges across 19 states are trying to find ways to increase the sort of STEM training that people need to go into this space. But at the same time, the United States, we barely have, we have the greatest designers when it comes to semiconductors, but we don't even make them ourselves anymore. And we don't, design is something that's now within the grasp of the Chinese. And so, as going back to Huawei and CIMIC with their attempts to build the 5 nanometer, I think you're going to see a real sharpening of the Cold War over semiconductors. AI is the next one, but I think I've spoken enough, and you may want to pull back on the question.
Well, you're absolutely right. Let's begin with that. From my perspective, anyhow, I think that your point about whether or not we've got the technicians to be able to keep up with this, even here ourselves. TSMC is putting a plant down in Arizona, and if you were to go down there today, they would tell you they're challenged with a number of aspects of whether it's obtaining U.S. labor, or it's whether it's even engaging Taiwanese labor, that they actually want to be there, and what to them would be Sleepy Town, Arizona, compared to Taipei or someplace there. And so there are various competitions that, even the 1,100 or so technicians they've got there as they're building this and stuff are starting to reveal some challenges that this, while we want to build it, there are some real efforts to it. You talk about putting in the STEM and community colleges and stuff, and there are real aspects, and it is not like you can build it today, as you know, and it is, we'll just play it out for the next few years. This is a constant evolving technology that, you've got to be in front of this every day to be competitive. I think, and maybe talk just a minute about AI, and I think U.S. is probably ahead today, but I don't know that that's a given forever. And in fact, where we're going with AI and quantum computing and your comments about semiconductors, I think is going to take us to a whole different level of everything, including warfare, and the things that were at primacy today, the aircraft carriers, etc., may not be in the tomorrows. Back over to you, Alex.
I think it'd be helpful for listeners and watch our audience to think about it this way. 5G and 6G and telecoms are the ability to, the pipelines for large amounts of data to be transferred and also censored, because you can have smart sensors, smart cameras and everything gathering all this data as a part of 5G. AI is going to enable us to process that data in real time. We used to not be able to have the ability to process all the sort of data that comes from something like 5G. But now if you have algorithms working through crunching this data, it becomes useful. And I think what that looks like if you apply it to any sector is it's revolutionary. You want to revolutionize the shipping industry. Let's get all the data on cranes, on ships, on containment, on the workforce, and process that to make the most efficient port. And you can really increase efficiencies in a way that your competitors cannot. So everyone is raising their research and development budgets. If you look across all the top 10 economies, everyone's trying to spend more on R&D. Interestingly, the United States is doing something that China has difficulty doing, which is trying to work through its alliances. The United States has always had a sort of approach towards multilateralism. You have the Quad working on civilian sort of technologies like the civilian applications of quantum, civilian applications of AI and telecoms. You also have AUKUS. AUKUS is very much driven by technology, not just the Pillar 1 on submarines, but Pillar 2 very much on the military applications for. And then, of course, Japan being possibly added to that to work on Pillar 2. There's also been efforts to get, U.S., Japan, and South Korea working on technology cooperation, which has gone through the NSC level. But from what I know, and I'm behind the curve on these internal discussions, is very much, trying to find a space for those three to work together outside of the political tensions between Seoul and Tokyo. So I think the United States it realizes, we're not the manufacturing great power that we were in World War II. We're not the great only source of innovation that we were in the 1950s to 70s. But we do have a lot of friends who are also very smart and whose own industries and technologies sort of grew off the back of our investments in their economies. And so I think whether or not that provides the sort of results, we'll see. But certainly if these things can be, if Pathfinder projects can be developed by the United States and key allies, it could really sort of be a force enhancer, and also can be, add to economies of scale. If you're going to do, 5G for the Indo-Pacific region, then you can probably bring the prices down from an individual U.S. Telecommunications company. And then finally, there's the story. If the U.S. and a group of countries do something, it might be more attractive to the customer, whether it's the global south, as we call it now, or the Indo-Pacific region, where there are some concerns about China driving all the infrastructure development in their country, where they may want alternatives. So, I'm not confirmed exactly whether the U.S. strategy is going to succeed, but it's very clearly that's what the strategy is.
Let's talk a little bit more about the U.S. Let's talk specifically about its tech policy. So U.S. strategies, especially in export controls, we spoke a little bit about that earlier. They've evolved across administrations to address the Chinese technological ascent. So here's the question now. How effective have these policy shifts been in countering China's tech rise?
So I'd say they have been tactically significant, but they have not, and they've slowed the Chinese down in areas, but they have not, I wouldn't say they've been, clear won battles. 5G was a classic example. China was very much intent on trying to gain the European dominance of the European 5G market, and they did not succeed in that. But on the other hand, US trade controls did not prevent Huawei from becoming, a semiconductor producer and becoming. So in some ways, is that a victory or a defeat? It's good that our NATO allies are not dependent on critical infrastructure built by Beijing. On the other hand, we've seen the Chinese respond very quickly and, pivot very quickly to develop other skills. They're not as intent on 5G. They're working on their own semiconductor, and they're also working on cloud computing and data, data architecture. So I think, Cold Wars aren't won quickly. You know, if you said in 1950s, well, Korea got invaded, I guess that's the end of the Cold War. You know, this is probably, assuming China ultimately collapses from the contradictions in its one-party system and sort of capitalist communist fusion, which is not a given by any stretch. If history repeated itself vaguely, we would look at maybe 70, 80 years before the party begins to feel the weight of its own contradictions in this new era. And so if that's the case, and again, that's a big if, then we're looking at least 60, 70 years of the United States and China competing very intensely on this. And that's what occurred in the first Cold War. So the bet, and I suppose this would be of great interest to our audience, is, you know, is pure capitalism going to survive that competition? We've already seen signs of the United States starting to mimic China. You know, we just released a national defense industrial strategy. The United States has never had a national defense industrial strategy. We are obviously stepping into, especially on green technology with the Biden administration, but also with semiconductors, the state is taking a more active role in protecting these technologies that are, for the most part, civilian. Telecommunications hasn't come under quite the same protections, but I wouldn't be surprised if that occurs if the Chinese renew their intent with 6G to sort of supplant their competitors around the global south. So yeah, I think we're in it for the long haul, and I suspect that China's the system it's found is working for it. They have probably, you know, 5 or 6 decades before this system begins to run out of money, because ultimately they're paying for a lot of things that are not market. They're not driven by the market. They're driven by policy and strategy. And, you know, we know how that goes. The Soviet Union looked, to the very end, looked extremely strong and robust until suddenly it wasn't. Again, that might not happen with China because they know how to sort of tweak it here and there. But what we could see is, you know, decades-long competition and the United States reaching more towards more state-driven economic tools and support than it traditionally has in the past.
I want to pull maybe a little bit on that and go a little deeper and talk more about the export control effects. And so tech export controls, I mean, they're increasingly crucial to the geopolitical arena, as you spoke, and they're shaping that landscape. And so the question then is, what impact do these controls have on a global tech scene, and what are their potential unintended consequences? Where might we find ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, they obviously, they are cutting the Chinese off from US suppliers, so the Chinese are going to Europeans and allies who may not be as tightly controlled. So it's benefiting Malaysia as a classic example. Malaysia right now is the main, it's become the fastest growing provider of semiconductor fabs. That was in the Financial Times last month. So yet there will be benefits for third-party countries, but this is true of others as well. If you have to remember, why did ASML become a champion? The small Dutch company that was a sort of derivative of Philips was because it wasn't Japanese. The Americans did not want to keep growing Japan's dominance in lithography, and so we ended up giving a sheer monopoly of lithography to the Dutch. So yeah, you're going to see, I think, with these trade controls, more rather than less market distortions, more geopolitical decision making rather than cost value. That will, as it did during the Cold War with certain key sectors, will play out as it does. But unlike the Cold War period, I don't think it will slow down the Chinese as much as we would like, because A, you have cyber, the ability to penetrate a country's economy and critical infrastructure from afar anonymously, and then extract large amounts of data without actually having to physically carry it. And then B, you have a much more sophisticated global market. You know, in the Cold War, the United States was the primary source with some European for the advanced technologies that we're discussing. But now there's, you know, semiconductors and EV, there's players in Germany, there's players in France, there's players that the Chinese can choose from who may be more willing to do the deal. I think the one thing that is also interesting, and this is sort of on the political side is the narrative. And unfortunately for us, I think you'll see China evoking this containment theme. The United States is trying to contain us and keep China down, which is not the case. I think it's
so it's
going to feed into
there are
that.
in fact policy thinkers who are advocating right now that we in fact do that very thing, right?
I think it's a self-licking ice cream cone. If you act in ways that are aggressive and you constantly, I was at a think tank in London where the guests from China basically hacked us while they're in the room. We then did not invite them back. In a sense, they created a bad relationship. And I think this is, we had the UK MOD just got attacked after two other attacks. If you look at Nortel, the Canadian telecommunications company that once dominated Canada's telecoms, I don't want to get sued here. Let's put this very carefully. Cyber attacks that are advantageous to China occurred such that Nortel is no longer a functioning company. And so what I think, when we come down to trade controls, it's reciprocity. Are we allowed to go into the Chinese market with those companies? Isn't that a fair idea that if they can invest in our digital infrastructure, can we invest in theirs? I think that's where you want to start. If you want to move the trade control dial, you need to encourage reciprocity and equality. At this stage, almost all the sectors that China would seek to invest in ours, they block us from investing in. And so that right there tells you that they view it as strategic and part of national security. So yeah, what's good for the goose should be good for the gander.
Let's talk about the tech governance future. The fast evolving tech landscape necessitates new governance and international cooperation models. So what are the key elements of an effective tech governance today, and what roles should various stakeholders play?
I think where we're seeing this play out most interestingly has been in data regulation.
Okay.
And in this sense, the Europeans were sort of, so just so you know, Europe, China, and the United States all have slightly different approaches towards data regulation.
Yes.
And I think in some ways they're instructive of the future of this debate. The United States is very open to commercial entities having our data. Yours and I's data is out there because America wants companies like Facebook and Meta and others to benefit from that data to be able to continue to innovate. On the other hand, we're pretty good with privacies that relate to the state and to health health data, etc. There's certain areas where we are somewhat careful. The Europeans are far more protective of data between individuals and commercial entities, but also for private data that we mentioned, the health data, etc. The Chinese have come out more on the European side, but in terms of their protections, but also what's interesting is that, like the Russians, they're encouraging the state to have complete access and control to all data internally. And in fact, not only had to have access to it, to store it physically inside the country. So from 2017, China's sort of data regulation requires that any Western companies or American companies that deal with Chinese citizens and store their data, just think of Meta, they have to keep those servers inside the country. Yeah. That, to me, is similar to Russia, by the way. It's not only part of the Cold War, but it's also part of this idea that it's not only who sets standards for future technologies, but who sets the sort of, keep it here, keep it at home. If India, which way is India going to go? Are they going to follow the Chinese model where they require everyone to keep their data inside India's national borders? And if everyone does so, what was the impact have on cross-sharing information as we do so easily now? The benefits of sharing the COVID code with scientists across the world, is very obviously universally apparent. And what happens when that sort of thing becomes highly regulated in countries that you have to require permissions? So I say that's the first one. And the second one's AI regulation. AI regulation is going to be huge because AI is going to be huge. And AI, in the military sense, of course, we can see all the ethical difficulties are already arising.
Yeah.
But the fact is that states' survival rest on their military capabilities. And so ethical considerations are always secondary to survival of the state. And that's true of democracies as well as authoritarian states. So I can imagine a technology Cold War will see AI develop at a much faster rate than it would have done in a non-Cold War situation, and with far fewer shackles. Although there will be many technology leaders who warn against this, the drivers are unfortunately inevitable. So I think those are, and everyone, I'm sure, watching this is aware of the dangers of AI broadly, not in a sort of Terminator way, but broadly, the impacts they have for crunching data behind a closed loop and producing, answers that we don't know how they got to those answers. That can create a lot of different distortions.
That's right. And when the closed loop starts teaching itself, and you integrate, just inject more false data.
Absolutely
and,
right.
It feeds itself. I think in the interest of time, I think I'd like to transition to the audience questions. We have several. And so let's talk first trade strategies. How can effective strategies counterbalance the competitive pricing of Chinese technology without compromising global competitiveness?
So we're already seeing Europe and the United States adopt some of the Chinese practices, which include state subsidies, tax breaks. You want to get a Taiwanese foundry to the United States, you're going to give them tax breaks, you're going to give them subsidies so that they're not losing business in order to set up in the United States. So I think the sort of neoliberal philosophy of the post-Cold War period, in which costs were the overriding priority, are now going to be secondary to national security drivers. So how does one stay competitive is essentially by, unfortunately, adopting more state tools. And the reason I say unfortunately is not because I'm a mad capitalist, but because innovation is so hard to control, and so many state-run economies in the past have not succeeded like China. The Russian internet is a famous failure, the Soviet internet. Singapore invested heavily in its semiconductor by its own state, and that never produced anything. So you're seeing a lot of waste.
Yeah.
You're seeing a lot of waste. And yes, China's done well, but they probably have spent trillions, not efficiently. It's just the scale of the country, and when they do get it right, that tends to grab headlines. I think what you may see some struggling to do, who are amongst our audience who are non-US and non-Chinese, is smaller minnows are going to get eaten. And I think companies who have valuable technology are going to be bought by either the United States or China. And so what countries have to do that want to, is they have to work with each other, like-minded other small to mid-sized states, and they have to develop investment regimes that are not onerous and do not stop for direct investment from coming in, but do protect some of their national champions from being gobbled up. And you can do that unofficially, like the French, or you can do it officially through a sort of legalized mechanism similar to CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investments in the United States.
Our next question asks us about proactive measures. What proactive strategies should the U.S. employ to assert its leadership in the global tech race?
I think the United States could probably, and I think the most proactive thing it can do, in some ways it is doing, so I sound like I'm sort of waving the flag, and that's not what I mean to do, but I'll explain. On the one hand, the United States has to rebuild some capacity at home, and that's not just good politics, it's not just making the voter happy, bringing jobs back, etc., which is still very important in a democracy. But it's also because some of these technologies, there were supply chain issues during COVID. Everyone realized this is a nightmare. You cannot expose, your country to those sorts of weaknesses. But we can't do that right across the board. We need to figure out, with allies and partners and like-minded states, what does a new distributed supply chain look like that is amongst reliable states? Doesn't have to be democracies, although democracies tend to view other democracies as favorable, as reliable. But for example, the protection equipment of masks. We produce all of our masks in China, and we had a great shortage when China nationalized those U.S. manufacturers in 2020. We saw the results where we were, for about 8 months at the beginning of the crisis, we had a major shortage. So if you think about semiconductors in the auto industry, semiconductors in the electrical vehicle industry, those are things where I think the United States wants to redevelop and reshore some capacity. But on the other hand, we also know that we're still not as competitive as it used to be in terms of salaries and in terms of workforce. We just haven't got the ability. So what you are going to see is what has been called manufacturing diplomacy by Assistant Secretary of Defense LaPlante, where we're going to offshore capability to allies and partners. So in the defense industrial space, for example, which some of these technologies, AI and quantum, are dual use, you will see some co-development, some co-production, and some co-maintenance and servicing. And then you'll see that in the civilian space. As I mentioned, the Quad Tech Network is one of the groups that I'm involved in that sort of tries to think through what are some of the technologies in the civilian side that we can co-develop across the region and for ourselves. You'll also see greater openness, hopefully, because a closed-off United States is not what we want to see. Greater openness for visa programs for STEM from trusted countries. India has a lot of engineers who are coming out of university every year. India cannot hire them all. What kind of programs can you do that sort of help both countries? Give those Indians training and jobs in Silicon Valley. When they go back to India to make in India, they are, they're the cutting edge. And likewise for Japan, Australia, and other allies like South Korea, we're going to see, hopefully, more cross-fertilization in those different areas.
I think you're right in that. I think we're probably going to have some policies and changes to make it so, but I think we're going to recognize that. I'm going to pull on with this next question from your last points made, and we'll talk about supply chain security. So the question is, what are the best practices for securing supply chains through friendshoring while upholding the free market principles?
Ask that again.
Yeah, the best practices for securing supply chain through friendshoring that upholds the free market principles. And so how do you make sure you're just not, it's not cronyism, right? I mean,
right.
You're friendshoring. Yeah.
I think it's supply chain between allies is so complicated. It's going to be so hard. The first thing every ally has to do is essentially map out its supply chain. So, is it, and it's expensive, takes a lot of time, and often it's not even done well. A single company can have multiple owners. Some of those owners may be compromised by board members. You have to really figure out what the standards are for supply chain that's clean. Once you decide on that, you have to build a mechanism for sharing those practices across allies and partners. The United States can lead, but we can't order.
Yeah.
We can't tell our closest allies and partners what to do. We can, similar to in the intelligence community, they have sort of clearance processes, right? This is a sort of, if you think about those who work in national security sectors or shipbuilding, welders for submarines, for example, those sorts of supply chains on the defense industrial side are going to have to, if we're going to, fragment that out to allies and partners and share that level, the clearances systems and clearances for companies are going to have to be standardized amongst friends and allies. We're going to have to agree on what a clean company or a clean individual is who can work in that space. And if you break out to that outer edge of the onion, you're talking about dual use sectors like AI and quantum, maybe academic research institutes, universities, where some of those applications go into the national security side, and some of them are just part of national security. You would have to do the same, and you'd probably have to be you wouldn't have to be as strict as those ones that are dealing directly with the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, but you would have to create amongst a large group of allies a sort of shared understanding. You would also have to share market intelligence. So that's something that countries don't do that well. The Defense Innovation Unit in the United States, it's one of the things that they're trying to develop is the ability to know, is this venture capitalist, yes, he's all active across Silicon Valley. Yes, he's an American citizen. Yes, he's got all these different projects to his name. Is he bankrolled by Beijing? That sort of level of information tends to be known by the market and not by governments, and governments need to invest in that capability. But there's a range of companies that do that. That's what they do. They look for risk for their own private sector, and so we need to develop that capability within states, within defense industry, within commerce departments, and sort of figure out if we're going to have this whole system, this whitelist as they call it, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of resources with our allies to figure all that out, is basically what I'm saying. It's not impossible, and if we're talking about a 60, 70 year competition plus, then it's something that you're going to have to do if you don't want to rely on, or you don't want to have a French semiconductor that has Chinese bits in it that actually can be a vulnerability to your system. So, yeah, I think that's what you need to do, is you need to develop those practices that allow you to build a clean supply chain. You need to define what a clean supply chain is, and you need to expect your allies and partners to put in the resources to do what you're trying to do.
That's well said. Let's go, this is a little bit maybe a repeat, but I think there's a desire to ask, and so to know more about this, so I'm going to pull on it more, and it's on the tech policy impact. So how can we effectively assess the impact of the policies that are designed to restrict China's access to advanced microchip technologies? What you understand?
It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do. One of the things I might, and I'll ask you if this is where you're going now. Are you asking the following question: if by trying to protect ourselves, are we not provoking the Chinese to indigenize their technology sector?
I think that's part of the question that's being asked.
I knew that was. How can we know? All I can tell you is their approach towards technology has long been, way before the Trump administration began to become hardcore, way even before Obama administration began to worry about supply chain. The party has always seen, from the Opium Wars, technology dominance is a thing that China needs to do to survive. And even long before, even in the best of days under Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, companies were excluded all the time. Google famously never got in.
Yeah.
You could argue, well, China only started to shut the West out recently. No, this has always been a, very set agenda, which has waxed and waned under different Chinese leaders. And under Xi Jinping in 2012, when we were still very, very open, long before, Trump announced, Xi Jinping came in thinking about all this in a very strategic way. And thus it ever was. I mean, to be honest, if you look back at the silk industry, China, refused to give the secrets of silk to any country for centuries. In some ways, they're calling foul on something that they've long practiced, which is countries seek to dominate strategic industries.
Nicely said. Before I let you go, could you recommend a book to our listeners that are eager to learn more about this tech rivalry and its implications?
Yes.
Okay.
If they're interested in semiconductors, I recommend The Chip War.
Ah, that is a well-read book around here. Chris Miller feels like that. Yeah.
If, my apologies. I'm planning so much for this talk. I forgot.
No. Well, thank you. This has been a brilliant talk, John. Thank you for it. As we wrap up, remember that informed communities strengthen resilience. Explore evolving Indo-Pacific security challenges with us on May 20th in our next Security Nexus webinar. The Philippines Builds Security, Faces Challenges, featuring Dr. Virginia Bakay-Watson, and we'll delve into the Philippines' strategic responses to evolving security threats and the importance of regional alliances within the Indo-Pacific. All of us at DKI APCSS thank you for being part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha oe.
As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.